Hello everyone, I'm Rick and thanks for joining me. Today we're looking at a 2-channel amplifier. But if you haven't already, I'd like to ask you to please hit the subscribe button to help the channel grow. This is the SMSL PA40 on loan from Ayoshida Audio. So a big thanks to them for their support. First things first, let's take a closer look at the unit. On the left side, we have a simple screen, and on the right side, a volume encoder that gets you into the menus as well and doubles as a power button. When I switch over the power rocker in the rear, you'll see a red LED turn on indicating there's power to the unit. We can power on the PA40 either with the remote control or with a long press of the encoder. The encoder gives us 60 steps of attenuation from -60 up to 0. Pressing the encoder gets us into the menu system, but I'll use remote control. We have volume up, volume down. Function will turn our screen off. Pressing the center button gets us into our menu, and the first one is labeled ET and gets us into our EQ tone. It does revert back to the volume fairly quickly. So if I go to ET and then press to the right, I'll go into the bass control, which goes up 7 steps and down 7 steps as well. If I press to the right again, I'll go into the treble for the same 7 up or 7 down. One more to the right and we have our gain, and we have low and high. I would suggest keeping this unit on low unless you have a device that has very low output, because on high gain, the PA40 recommends that you have no more than 1.2 volts coming in. So now back into the menu, and if I press down, I'll go into our EQ settings. EQ 0 is direct mode. And if I press up, we'll go into our preset EQs of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Going past the gain, you'll go into your brightness level, and here we'll get 8 levels of brightness, from 1 to 8, and it actually gets pretty bright. I like it around 3 or 4. Again, the function button turns the light off. Let's take a look at the back side. From the left, we have one set of RCA single-ended ins, followed by our speaker level outputs, right and left. And the binding posts are pretty nice. I prefer to use them still with the banana plugs, but you can use bare wire or spades as well. And continuing over, our IEC with power rocker. And it's a very solid rocker. Looking at the inside, on the left, there's a custom power supply with a steel shield covering a pair of large electrolytic capacitors, and the same towards the front of the unit. There's another steel case here surrounding a few more caps. On the right side is the amplifier board. It's very clean and neat. One thing that stood out to me in a good way was how the designer or engineer decided to mount one inductor perpendicular to the other, which is always a good idea when inductors are closer than a few inches to keep their fields from interacting with each other. And I don't think I've seen this in any of the PA3255 amps that I've looked at. Now another thing that stood out to me, but this time in a bad way, was up here at the IEC inlet. The ground is floating or not connected to the chassis. Now maybe this is what sounds best with this amp, but then SMSL should have just used a 2-prong IEC instead of a 3-prong, which implies that the chassis is grounded. Or leave that 3-prong IEC, but add a ground lift toggle. But that's not really a deal breaker for me. There's plenty of space to add a ground if needed. An Infineon MA5332 chip resides under this slim heatsink, and while the heatsink does look small, the MA5332 is very efficient, and I've never felt this amp get even a little bit warm with a few days of continuous use, which isn't something I can say for some of the TPA3255 amps. Generally speaking, the build quality is good. The chassis does have a little bit of flex, and while the plastic encoder works totally fine, it would have been nice for it to be aluminum with a little bit of texture. It would have just upped the class of this unit. Aesthetically, I really dig the clean modern look. It's uncluttered and classy. I have my SMSL DO100 Pro DAC on loan to a friend, so I don't have it here to show it to you stacked. However, the DO100 Pro and DO200 Pro are the same form factor and match perfectly aesthetically with the PA40. Now let's go through some specs. The SMSL PA40 is rated at 165 watts times 2 at 4 ohms and 85 watts times 2 at 8 ohms. But that's at 10% distortion. If we look at the measurement graphs provided, we can see that at 1% we're getting closer to 75 watts times 2 at 8 ohms. Which I would think is just fine for most home applications. The THD% is at 0.004%, but the SNR is at 100 decibels. Definitely not as quiet as say a Fosse V3, but more on that later. Again, that input sensitivity, on low gain, we need at least 580 millivolts, and on high gain, 315 millivolts. But again, the maximum input on high gain is 1.2 volts. So I'd say for most cases, you'd want to keep this amp on its low gain. On to listening impressions. On the amp's direct mode with its EQ set to 0, in my main system and 8 feet away from my speakers, the first thing that stands out is a thinness in the lower bass. And it's pretty evident compared to my Iota VX PA3, IEMA BO7, and Duke Audio F5. Now setting the bass tone control up to +1 alleviates this issue. And then I'm super satisfied with the bass. And I just asked myself, why didn't SMSL decide to leave the stock setting at the +1 on the bass? I think it would have left a better first impression. But regardless, once you adjust that, the amp sounds great. The mid-range is great and everything comes off as fairly natural. And the treble is crisp and shiny without being harsh. And when I crank up the volume, I do get a nice sense of scale and dynamics. I think the PA40 gives you a very fun presentation. Nice and punchy with fast transients. And the layering and imaging is good for its price. But the background isn't exactly black. And that's evident with a little bit of hiss at high volumes with no signal present. The $140 Fosi V3 and $170 IEMA B07 are both dead silent with a darker background. So if that's your thing, pass on the PA40. However, what the PA40 gives you in exchange for its $140 asking price is a more complete package compared to the V3 and a lower price point compared to the B07. With the PA40, you get a remote control of volume, tone controls, and a few EQ presets. And speaking of the presets, I really dig that Aoshida Audio posts this frequency response graph of the EQs to give you a better idea of what each setting is doing. I also tested the PA40 in near field, connected to my Audio Engine P4 speakers 30 inches apart and 24 inches from my ears. And in that scenario, the bass that was thin in my den setup was a non-issue at my workstation. And because I tend to listen at low to medium volumes at my workstation, the noise wasn't a big deal either. I actually had more noise coming out of the fans of my PC. A nice punchy bass with great mids and crystal clear treble. Now onto a few things I would have liked to have seen. I think if you're going to put a volume encoder onto an amplifier and make it an integrated amplifier, at that point you might as well add another set of inputs. So maybe an additional RCA in or an XLR in would have been nice. For a straight power amp, I wouldn't worry about it. I also would have liked to have seen a set of pre-outs to send that attenuated signal over to another power amp or to a set of powered speakers. And finally, a sub out. I personally don't use the sub out on most of these little amps as I prefer to go through my preamp. However, sub outs are in high demand right now. And I think it's going to be one of the main cons that people bring up about this amp and other amps like this, the lack of a subwoofer out. Of course, all these features would add cost to the amplifier, but I don't see why it couldn't be done for, let's say, $180, in which case I'd still think it'd be a good deal. So my final thoughts on the SMSL PA40. For near field, I would definitely recommend. For a small bedroom or office, again I would give it a recommend. Now for medium listening rooms on the other hand, if you want the most pristine sound that you can get for around $150, the PA40 might not be the one. But if convenience is your thing and you want that remote control to handle your volume and tone controls, and you'll use this amp for more background music for entertaining, the PA40 will do a great job. When playing background music and your friends are chatting, you'll hear fun, energetic music that can be EQ'd to your taste. Pair it with the $89 SMSL PS200 DAC or the $220 DO100 Pro DAC for a very nice little system. So that's all I have for this one, guys. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.